Hi, I'm Scott, and this is Great Scott Knitting, a podcast, episode 4. Welcome to those of you who are new to this podcast channel. Thank you for checking me out. I hope you enjoy what you experience on this channel. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with me. I appreciate your support. Today in Wichita, Kansas, it's going to be partly cloudy with a high of 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity is going to be around 39%. So hot and dry, a good day to sit back, have a nice cold drink, and do some knitting. So the past couple of weeks, I have been, of course, knitting, and I was able to complete one object that I have been working on, and that was my tropical typhoon shawl. That's what I'm calling it. This shawl is what I have completed. The pattern is Typhoon by Josh Ricks Ravinsky. It's a crescent shawl with garter stitch bands. But the interesting thing about this is that it has one of the garter stitch bands is on the bias, which makes it very interesting. Now, this pattern actually is intended for more of a self-striping yarn to be where I've used this variegated color. But I thought it worked out really nicely with this variegated yarn that I used. The yarn is Knit Pick Stroll Fingering Sock yarn, which is a 75% merino wool, 25% nylon blend. And the colors are hand dyed. I dyed these myself using food coloring. So the one is sort of a tealish blue, it's a little bit tonal. You might be able to pick up some of the different shades within that blue. And then the variegated is also something I hand dyed. And I thought they worked relatively nicely together, especially in this project. So that I was really excited to get off the needles and to be able to share with people and show people. I do have a couple of other projects that I have in progress. So my works in progress right now are, I'll start with the smaller one. This one is the Heartland Lace. Heartland Lace is a pattern by Evelyn Clark for, it's a DK weight lace pattern. And the yarn I am using with this pattern is the Knit Crate Vidalana Lofty DK, which is a 48% merino, 20% alpaca, 32% organic cotton, and the colorway is called Firewood. Now, this yarn is somewhat different from other yarns I've used in the past, in that instead of twisted, the standard twist, it is woven. So it's kind of a braided twist to it as opposed to a standard twist. The feel of this yarn is really, really nice. It's very tactily enjoyable to knit with. And it has a lot of stretch and give to it. So right now the lace in this doesn't really show up too well, but I think once it gets blocked out, it's going to open up really nicely and look really great with this yarn. The other project I'm working on is a design that I'm working on, and I'm calling it right now Quaker Ridge and Eyelet Shawl. The stitch pattern I'm basing it on is the Quaker Ridge pattern, which is basically sections of stockinette with a garter ridge that comes along, and then reverse stockinette ending with an eyelet band. So you kind of can see that in there, the stockinette, garter ridge, then just reverse stockinette with an eyelet band at the end of it. This is intended for worsted weight, so it's going to be a heavier shawl, much more suitable for wintertime. And so yeah, I'm just right now I'm playing around with it. My intention is to have it use two separate colors. I'm going to play around with this once I get it finalized with a couple of different skeins that I have, to see how well it plays with different types of combinations of colorways and yarn. But right now I have it doing some very distinct bands with this light blue into the white. So I have a solid section, stripe section, solid, stripe, solid, and so on. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to end this shawl once I reach that point of ending it. So that'll be a surprise for all of us at this point. The yarn that I'm playing around with right now, as I'm actually experimenting, is Loops and Thread Impeccable Solids. It's 100% acrylic. The colorway is white and clear blue. So that is one of the second project that I'm working on, is that particular design. When I am done with it, I do plan on writing it up and publishing it on Ravelry. All right, acquisitions. Over the past couple of weeks, I have received some yarn in the mail. I am a Knit Crate subscriber, so I do get the monthly box from Knit Crate. And the June box did finally arrive in the last weeks of June. And here's what was in this month's June Knit Crate. This yarn is called Audine Wool's Interlock Sport. And this yarn is a 35% linen, 24% cotton, 19% tencel, and 11% nylon. And this colorway that I have is Haze, which is a tonal violet, tonal purple yarn. It's very pretty. This is a sport weight yarn, and it is 351 yards, 100 grams per skein. Have no idea what I'm going to do with these particular skeins of yarn yet. I love the yarn that I get from Knit Crate, but I'm not always crazy about the patterns that they include in their subscription boxes. I don't know, they don't tend towards the things that I enjoy knitting, so I will find something that I'm excited about knitting with that particular yarn. But it's very pretty. It has a lovely feel, and being linen and cotton, one of the things I have read about linen is that the more it is used and washed, the softer it gets. So I'm looking forward to making probably a shawl with that particular yarn. This weekend, I did a little bit of yarn dyeing, so I do have some yarn dyeing experiments that I want to show you the result of. So the first skein of yarn that I dyed this weekend is this skein here. This yarn is Swish worsted weight from Knit Picks. It's 100% superwash merino wool. And don't know what to call this colorway, but my what inspired me with these particular colors that I chose, which were sort of a peachy orange, a pink, pinkish color, and then dots of blue. So it's sort of, I guess you would call it speckled with the blue dots within it. But I kind of, for myself, I'm calling it splotch because it's not actually like a powder that I used. I actually just took food coloring and dropped the food coloring directly onto the yarn in a shallow pan. So the technique that I used for this particular skein, I used actually two separate techniques. I started off by having a dry skein of yarn that I twisted into a loose hank and then did an immersion dye into a peach color, food coloring. And then when that was dye was exhausted, I pulled it out, unwound that hank, retwisted it to expose some undyed yarn in the hank, and then re-dyed it in a reddish pink. And when that dye bath was finished, I then put it into a shallow roasting pan with a little bit of water, and then did the splotch dyeing, or I guess speckle dyeing, with the blue food coloring to give it those little dots of intense blue throughout. So inspired by a bowl of fruit that I recently had, which had peaches, strawberries, and blueberries in it. So that was kind of the inspiration behind this particular colorway that I created. So it's very, very mottled, and it almost kind of has I mean, because I did dye it on the 4th of July, it does kind of have a, sort of that fireworks kind of feel to it, with lots of different colors, all, completely disorganized. So I'm really pleased with how it turned out. It's very pretty, and so I'm looking forward to finding a project to use this particular yarn with. The second skein of yarn was also a Swish worsted 100% superwash merino wool. And with this skein, I finally broke down and experimented with cake dyeing. So basically, I took the hank of yarn, the bare yarn, and wound it into a very loose cake of yarn, and then placed that cake of yarn into a dye bath. And this had neon purple food coloring. And because it is in a loose cake, most of the dye is going to absorb on the outside, and so you get that really intense purple color on the outside. But then as it moves towards the center, less and less of the dye gets taken into the fiber. And purples and violets do have can sometimes break, and by break I mean it breaks into its different, especially purple is really great for this. It will break into reds and blues. This did not break, but I did get a really nice variant or a really nice fade from the intense purples through some pinks and into still some undyed sections, but very, very light pink. There are occasional dots where the color did break and you get the blue, but those are very, very rare. One of the things I do like about cake dyeing, whether you get the breaking of a color into its primary colors or not, what you do get is what is called, I would call reverse speckling. So notice that instead you have the white speckles, and that comes from the way the cake is wound. It has resists in different places so that the dye doesn't take up into those spots, kind of like when you do tie dye. So I have some reverse speckling throughout the colorway. So I really am happy with how it turned out. It's very nice, a very nice gradient color. I very well might use those two skeins of yarn in a project together. Don't know. I have to think about that a little bit. So, what am I casting on in the next couple of weeks? And I'm not really sure that I have an answer for that. I've been looking around Ravelry and I'm not seeing, okay, let me start over. I have a lot of worsted weight wool that I'm wanting to knit up into some various projects. I am not a big fan of sweaters, so you're not going to see a lot of that. So part of my drive to create the worsted weight shawl and start designing a worsted weight shawl was with the idea of using some of my worsted weight wools that I've been collecting in that shawl. So over the next couple of weeks, as I finalize this design, I'll probably cast on a version of that is in one of my worsted weight wools that I have going on. So that's probably what I'll be casting on. I don't know, something might jump out at me on Ravelry, or I might do a hat or a scarf or something. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But one thing I do know, I'll have a project on the needles. So other things that are going on. Still watching Star Wars, only I have not completed Clone Wars, but I'm taking a break from it. I am at the last season, and I did promise my husband that I would watch it with him. So I'm waiting on watching the last season of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. So I am currently watching Star Wars Rebels. I started over from the beginning. That's one of the newer series that have been created in the Star Wars realm, and it's a animated version or an animated series that I really did enjoy. So I'm watching that one over just to re-immerse myself and keep myself immersed in the Star Wars world, which as you can see behind me is one of the things that I enjoy. My husband and I did complete watching all of the available seasons of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, leaving us cliffhung at the end of season 3. So we're hoping to see season 4 come along in the future. Of course, with COVID, I don't know when that might happen. So those are some of the things that I'm doing in terms of watching TV and or watching streaming things going on. Here in Kansas, we are not locked down with the COVID virus, but we do have a mask order that has been recommended, and thank God our city has made it a requirement, so you can't go out in public without your mask, which I wholly support. Of course, I very seldom leave the home anyway, but when I do, I always have my mask on. things are still crazy out there, of course, with COVID and with continuing to battle the racial issues that America has. And as I mentioned in my last podcast, one of the things that helps me to process some of the craziness that's going on in the world is, of course, knitting. But I also turn to my religion and to my traditions. And so I'm going to share with you some things that came up for me this week with the Torah portion that we are focusing on in the Jewish faith this past week. So yesterday was Shabbat. Yesterday was July 4th. And yesterday's Torah portion was one of my absolute favorite sections of Torah, which is the Torah portion called Balak. Yeah, my brain went numb there for a moment. The interesting thing about this Torah portion is the talking donkey. Of course, naturally, that's why it's my favorite. Yes, the Bible has a talking donkey. This one is not something I learned about when I was a kid. I had to be an adult to learn it when I finally learned about Balaam and the talking donkey. But that's what was going on in this Torah portion. There are a few other things that go on in this Torah portion. Some of the big highlights are, so you have the Israelites wandering in the desert still. They the years have progressed since they were cursed, in a sense, by God to wander in the desert for 40 years and for 40 years, waiting to be able to get into the promised land. And the old guard, the older people that came out of Egypt, are beginning to die off. And in fact, in this Torah portion, Miriam, who is the key female character that leads the Jewish people, and her brother Aaron, who is the high priest for the Jewish people, they both die in this Torah portion. And also within this Torah portion, we read about the Israelites doing battle with different groups of peoples in this region and conquering them and being successful. Of course, the Torah reading lets us know that this is because God is on their side and helping them to defeat their foes. Well, one of the peoples that are sort of next in line for the Israelites to encounter is the kingdom of Moab and their king Balak. Well, Moab, or King Balak, realizes and has been watching what's going on with the Israeli people. And as they march toward his land and conquer all of his neighbors, he starts getting a little bit worried that it appears that they have some blessings on their side that are allowing them to be very powerful. So he thinks, okay, if I can curse the Israeli people, they will lose faith and I will be able to conquer them. So he sends for a guy by the name of Balaam. And Balaam has a reputation of those people that he curses are cursed, and those people that he blesses are blessed. So he has this reputation. Balak sends messengers to him to say, hey, I want you to come. I want you to curse the Hebrew people so that I can defeat them. The messengers get to Balaam, and they, give him Balak's request. And Balaam is like, well, I'll have to think about this. And he says, stay the night. I'll let you know my answer in the morning. In a dream, God tells him, don't go. The Hebrew people are my people and they are blessed. When Balaam wakes up, he says, I'm not going to go. God has told me not to go curse the Israelites. So the messengers go back to Balak. They tell him what Balaam said. Balak gets a little upset with this and decides, okay, I'm going to send another set of messengers, more important messengers. So not the low lives, the next level up. So he sends another set of messengers to Balaam. And Balaam was like, I've already told you that God has told me I can't go. But he's like, you know what? I'll sleep on it again. I'll let you know my answer in the morning. This time God tells him, all right, go ahead, go, but with this proviso. You can only say what I tell you to say. So the next morning, Balaam wakes up. He tells the messengers, yes, okay, I'll go back with you. However, I can only do what God tells me to do. I can't necessarily do what Balak wants. So they're on the road, and God being, I don't know, I guess maybe a trickster. I've never quite figured out why God does this, but God decides to set an angel in their path that has a flaming sword. But the only one who can see this angel with the flaming sword is Balaam's donkey. So Balaam is riding his donkey and they're going along the road. The donkey sees this angel with a flaming sword and turns off of the road. This angers Balaam, and so he gets off his donkey, beats the donkey, gets back on the path. They continue on the road. This happens 3 times. The final time, the donkey goes off the road and then sits down. And Balaam is beating the donkey, and the donkey finally says, why are you beating me? Why do you do this? And he's like, Balaam answers him and says, because you're not taking me to the kingdom of Balak. And the donkey replies to Balaam, have I ever done this before? Have I ever been disobedient? I've always done the things that you want. And Balaam is like, well, yes, you have. At that point, Balaam then can see the angel with the flaming sword, realizes why the donkey has not been following his orders, and then is contrite and begs forgiveness from the angel, begs forgiveness from the donkey. And the angel says, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and let you go forward, but keep in mind, the only reason that you are alive is because the donkey went off the road 3 times. And he's like, also, when you get to Balak, only the things that God tells you to say are what you're allowed to say. Balaam is like, yes, I agree to that. And they go on their way. So they get to Balaam, or they get to the kingdom of Moab. They get to Balak. Balaam is there, and he's like, okay, I'm going to warn you. I can only say what God tells me to say, even though you're asking me specifically to curse the Hebrew people. So Balaam tells Balak to make sacrifices, and each time when he makes these sacrifices, Balak goes to curse. He's supposed to curse the Hebrew people, but what comes out of his mouth is a blessing. Balak hears this and he's like, no, you don't understand. You're supposed to curse these people. Why aren't you doing what I asked? And he's like, because I warned you, I can only say what God told me to say. Balak then has Balaam go to a different mountaintop, and they redo the procedure. Again, another blessing comes out of Balaam's mouth. Balak gets mad. He says, I'm going to do this again. So they go to another mountaintop. They do it all again. And this final time, Balaam goes to, utter his curse on the Hebrew people, and what comes out of his mouth is a very famous line or very famous phrase that Jewish people usually sing before or at every Shabbat, and that is Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenoteka Yisrael, which means how good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. That is a very famous song that we sing at the beginning of Shabbat. And the blessing actually goes on with some other things, but again, Balak is at his wit's end, and he's like, fine, leave. You clearly aren't going to be able to do what I need you to do. And he feels resigned. So Balaam leaves, and then the Torah portion ends with the Hebrews kind of settling down in the area near Moab. And there is a group of Hebrew men who start carrying on with some Moabite women, start worshiping some Moabite gods. God gets angry, tells Moses to kill the leaders of this group of people who have strayed. So Moses does kill the leaders of the people who strayed, and several thousand Hebrews wind up dead at the end of this Torah portion. That is not uncommon. God often got mad with the Hebrew people for backsliding on what he asked them to do. So that's the gist of everything that goes on in the Torah portion. So what does that really mean? Well, for me, the whole section kind of pivots on this talking donkey. Because you're not expecting it. It's an entirely unexpected piece of story within this Torah portion. And really, when you think about it, in simply the line of the storytelling, the talking donkey really doesn't change the actual outcome of the Balaam story. Balaam still goes to the kingdom of Moab. He still, he does his sacrifices 3 times. He blesses the Hebrew people 3 times. None of that changes for the fact of the talking donkey. Well, there was one thing, that if there hadn't been a talking donkey, he might have gotten killed along the roadside by an angel with a flaming sword, which may have slowed down the whole story there. But, so what was the purpose of a talking donkey? God had already said, yeah, it's okay for you to go, and then we have this whole talking donkey thing. Here's where I think what it means. And in some of the studying that I did around and have done around this particular Torah portion, there is a midrash, and midrash is rabbinic discussions of Torah from the past. And there are some teachings in midrash that say God closed the mouths of animals so that people could subjugate them. The donkey represents the lowest of creatures, and Balaam is among the wisest of men. So you have this huge power dichotomy. So one of the most powerless of animals and one of the most powerful of men. But in this story, as soon as the donkey opens its mouth and speaks, the power dynamic shifts. Notice in the story that immediately Balaam changes his ways. He apologizes for beating the donkey, and he sees the errors he starts to see things from the donkey's perspective. He sees the angel with the flaming sword. The power of speech, according to the rabbis in Midrash, is an expression of power. our and the lack of the power of speech is an aspect of subjugation. When you are a subjugated people, when you are a marginalized people, your power of speech is usually also marginalized. Therefore, your ability to act and to reduce your subjugation is reduced. Looking at where we are today in America, we can easily see many situations where marginalized people's power of speech, their ability to speak out, has been subjugated, has been curtailed. And so their power has also been marginalized. Their power has been curtailed. Their level of freedom and liberty has been curtailed. When you look at the African Americans, the Black people in our society, they clearly have been subjugated. Their ability to speak out on their own behalf is belittled in an effort to remove their power. Look at when Black athletes would kneel during the national anthem. Not something particular, in my mind, not something particularly not something that should really make us angry. I mean, to kneel is to, in a sense, put yourself in a humble position. But it was also a method by which we've tried to speak out. You don't listen, so let's try this act. And immediately that act was belittled. So again, trying to remove the power of being able to speak out for yourself, and to use speech to try to continue to subjugate. We saw that from people in power over the athletes that were trying to express their dissatisfaction with our justice system. We see that in the LGBT community, where especially back in the 50s, the 60s, well, actually all through history up until today, how gays and lesbians have been subjugated, how their ability to express themselves as who they are has been curtailed and has been pushed down. We finally, in the last 20 years, have truly seen strides and gains in being able to live our lives as who we are and have our power of speech, our power of expression recognized and taken seriously. What we do still see as a struggle are transgender people. They are not recognized in our society as equal people. So, there's lots of work to be done. The African American community is not seen as having equal standing in our society. That is certainly work that needs to be done. And we are seeing right now, over the past months, a people standing up and saying no more, using their power of expression, using their power of speech. And we are seeing that those that have the power, the white people, the rich people, belittling that speech, either saying the protests aren't protests, they're looters, all lives matter, not just black lives. That belittling of the speech and the expression that is being used, we see that today. We see that continued subjugation of that particular community. We still see subjugation of gay and lesbian community. You know what? We still live in a society where it can be dangerous for same-sex couples to walk hand in hand down the street and not either have someone say something or even at times have people do things to harm those people that are simply expressing themselves with each other. Having that slightest bit of touch in public, things that different sexed relationships don't even think about. They take that for granted. That is an expression, a power of expressing themselves that they have that they don't realize that others do not. So what is this? For me, this means that we all have this power of speech, and we have to consider how we use it and what we do to express ourselves and express ourselves in ways that don't disempower others and for our own benefit, especially those of us who might be straight, cisgendered, Christian, white. That's the norm in our society. That's what has been considered the norm in our society. They have, unfortunately, most of the power. And I think what we're beginning to see is an opportunity to reflect on that power we have and how we use that power to subjugate others or to lift others up, to end that subjugation. And I think part of the way that we do that is to start to listen, to start to see things through others' eyes, to see the obstacles that others face, to see that angel with the flaming sword, and to come to terms with those angels that block our path to moving forward together. Just as in the Torah portion, Balaam and the donkey could not move forward until they came to understand those things that were in their way. And I believe that is part of what this Torah portion tells us with this talking donkey. Thus ends the Devar Torah for this episode. I don't know if I'll always do a Devar Torah. For those of you who may not know that term, Devar Torah means a word of Torah or an interpretation of a Torah section. I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoy giving my spin on some of these different stories that come up in the liturgical readings of the Jewish people. So I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you have, click like. If you enjoy this channel, click subscribe. My social media connections, I do have a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/GreatScottKnitting. I'm on Instagram as GreatScottKnitting, and I'm on Ravelry as GreatScottKCMO. Thank you for joining me today, and have a great time knitting.